Hey everybody, this is I think it's going to be our last regular video of this unit. And let's see if this works better, because I know people have been saying they've been having trouble seeing it, and I didn't know I could do this at the same time, but let's try. So this is about mercantilism versus capitalism in the colonies. Just about all this is about mercantilism, but that's okay. So you should have learned a bit about mercantilism last year, about how that happened after the Columbian Exchange, and actually before the Columbian Exchange, as explorers are trying to acquire wealth. There's a few points you want to remember about mercantilism. That the goal was that they had a favorable balance of trade. The nations involved, and pretty much all European nations were mercantilists at this time. They wanted to be able to produce marketable goods that they could sell. This is even before the Industrial Revolution, mind you. They wanted to take in little imports, right? They wanted to export a lot, but not take in. They also wanted to accumulate a lot of silver and gold. They thought that there was only so much of it in the world, so the more they got, the better. And I don't know if anyone recognizes who this is or what movie it's from, but maybe I'll ask you next class. Okay. Now, Great Britain had some specific aims under the term of mercantilism. They wanted to encourage growth of a native merchant marine fleet, which would include colonial ships. So not so much boats used for war, but boats used for trade. They wanted to protect English manufacturers from foreign competition. They wanted to protect English agriculture, especially the grain farmers. And they wanted to accumulate as much hard money as possible. Right? Americans had to pay for everything with hard currency, which there wasn't much of in the colonies. So instead, they often paid with things like tobacco or other goods instead of cash. Colonial paper wasn't even legal tender in England. So the coins that actually circulated in America were often Spanish or Dutch if they could be obtained. So that's sort of interesting. So the American colonies, they didn't doubt that they benefited from being part of the British Empire, and they were protected from the British Empire. So even with this heavy system of the British mercantile system, they benefited from the fact that many crops grown in the Americas weren't known in Europe, and exporting them became very lucrative. The transfer of crops and animals were completed as well. Among the crops that they went to Europe and Asia even were potatoes, tomatoes, corn, tobacco, sugar, all crops that had a high economic value. The potato in particular had a significant impact on world food production, in that it gave more nutrition per acre than any crop grown. So you should have learned a lot about that last year with the Columbian Exchange, right? But now this is the stuff you want to know about. You want to know a little bit about the Navigation Acts, and that's going to be what your next in-class assignment will be about. The Navigation Acts also demanded that raw materials be imported into England from the colonies in order to support British manufacturing. So the 1650 and 1651, it forbade importation into England of all goods except those carried by English ships or ships owned by the producing country, which basically meant the colonies in this case. So that would eliminate basically like a third-party carrier. Foreign ships were barred from trading in the colonies. So there weren't going to be foreign ships coming to the colonies, only British ships. Then we have the 1660 Navigation Act. It forbade the importing into or the exporting from the British colonies of any goods except, once again, in English or colonial ships. And even these colonial ships, at least 1/4 of the crew had to be British. And it forbade certain things from the colonies like sugar, tobacco, wool, and cotton from being shipped to any country except to England or some English plantation somewhere in the world. Then there were more acts passed in the 1660s and 1670s, and they sought further control of the kind of goods that could be shipped to and from the colonies and the methods by which they could be shipped. A lot of these were to tighten enforcement because a lot of these prior acts weren't really enforced. Ways they would do that would be by patrolling the coastline all up and down the Americas, with all of its bays and rivers. And you realize that could be difficult and that could be costly. Okay, so the navigation acts, while they seemed really rough on paper, were very loosely enforced, and the colonists offended the acts and even became smugglers. So you don't need to know and memorize the details of every act, but you want to understand the overall effects of them. And we'll come back to them actually when we get into the revolution. So this is what you want to think about, is how did the colonists feel about all this going on? Keep in mind, in theory, they had no real objection to the navigation acts. They weren't directed specifically against the colonies, but actually against Britain's competitors, namely the Dutch. So they weren't really considered to be taxation, they were more considered to be regulation. But they still found them irritating because in practice, these acts tended to work for the interests of England at the expense of the colonies. So they didn't really appreciate that. So Americans avoided paying duties or basically taxes related to this act whenever they could. And basically, it was almost all the time. It was too expensive for the British to actually try to collect duties in the Americas, which was still pretty lightly populated at the time. The acts didn't really alienate the colonists. Colonial governors only enforced these when they felt like it. It was usually too difficult to enforce. Enforcement was expensive and impractical. So the seeds of revolution didn't really take place into the 1760s, but this is after these navigation acts in a couple decades. By the 1700s, tension begins to grow between the colonies and England. Now, what about capitalism? We said that it was a mercantilist economy in the colonies, and it was. It wasn't a capitalist economy, but the seeds from capitalism were there. And there's a book, Out of Our Past, by Carl Degler, and he even writes in there that capitalism came in the first ships, meaning the ones to Jamestown and even the ones to the New England colonies. Keep in mind how supply and demand relate to capitalism, and there was a demand for land and there was a huge supply there. They knew they could make money from tobacco. They became traders. And unfortunately, even the Royal African Company, which traded slaves, had a bit of a capitalist influence. So because of the trade, because of all these things involved, they did have capitalist seeds. However, none of them represent what we now consider modern capitalism. So the farming, the commerce, the trading, that was elements of capitalism, but the technology wasn't there and the manufacturing wasn't there just yet. So it is a mercantilist company, but you do see the seeds of capitalism there. All right, so we'll go over this next class if you have any questions. And like I said, don't worry about knowing the details of which navigation act was which, just mostly understand its effects. All right, see you soon.